Right, we're set to go. All right, so our job today is to talk about attachment in infancy, infant attachment, specifically. But let's just kind of go through kind of what we've already talked about. Attachment is basically our emotional bond. In this case, with infancy, we usually talk about a particular person. So it can be attachment to mom, dad, caregiver, siblings. And that attachment, especially in infancy, can kind of be different for each of those individuals. But the primary attachment we really focus on in infancy is the attachment between the mother and the child. Mother being that primary person that is kind of, responsible for that infant's life 24/7. So if it's a single dad and there's no female mother figure, and he is mother. Okay, and I just want to kind of make that clear that it's not necessarily the biological female person who's defined in this relationship as the mother. Okay. Parents, we know that parents are used as what's called a secure base for exploration. And this is kind of where attachment theory comes into play, is dependent upon the child's attachment will be how they utilize their parents to securely go and explore their world. Okay. I think we're going to talk about. We're going to specifically focus on three individuals: Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. Harry Harlow is first going to challenge the notion of early theories about breastfeeding and about infant care with some famous studies he did with macaque monkeys. And then John Bowlby is going to come along and refine what Harry Harlow did and give us what we call today attachment styles. And then Mary Ainsworth is a person who's going to come in and, using young children, she's going to be the one who's going to run experiments that's going to test all of these different attachment styles that John Bowlby developed. So that's kind of the progression of the three individuals that we'll focus on for this. But let's talk about early theories of infant mother interaction. Okay. It was once believed that the only job of the parent was to provide the infant with nourishment. Okay. Mother's breast milk, as you would say. And that comfort, the holding each other, the emotional bond really isn't necessary for an infant to develop or for an infant to be successful. If you have had grandparents and stuff who say, you coddle your infant too much, those kinds of things, that's where this viewpoint kind of comes from. And it was really promoted by people like Sigmund Freud, who believed, and the behaviorists. Sigmund Freud saying that, the only attachment, that early, remember we talked about his early first stage of development was the oral phase. And he believed that the only need for mother is to provide that oral sustenance for the infant and nothing else mattered. The behaviorists believe that you got to condition the infant to respond the way you want to respond. And so we get methods like the cry it out method and establishing routines early on. But the warmth, the emotional connection just was not important anymore. Okay. The first person to actually challenge Freudian and behaviorist types of theories about the relationship between infants and mothers was Harry Harlow. Okay. And he aimed to disprove this in 1958 using what are known as macaque monkeys, which are one of our closest genetic relatives in the animal kingdom that we have. And what he did is he raised baby macaque monkeys in two artificial environments. Okay. And basically what these artificial environments look like is either you have a terry cloth wired fake mom. Okay, so it's a wire monkey that has terry cloth and everything. And then you had a wire monkey that just has a bottle. Okay. Now, in Harlow's mind, what he believed is that Freud and the behaviorist was right. The baby monkey should prefer just the wire monkey with the bottle, with the food. But that's not what he found. That, in fact, what he found is that the little infant monkeys would only leave the terry cloth monkey in order to eat. Okay. Indeed, in some cases, these little guys would get to the point of starvation before they would leave the terry cloth mom. Okay. Whoops. There we go. Okay. And then the other part of this too is in other conditions where the only condition that the infant had access to was the wired monkey with the bottle. So the little monkey didn't have access to the terry cloth one, but just access to the wired monkey. And what Harlow found is that when they then introduced the little monkey to the troop, to the gang of monkeys, because monkeys are highly social species, the young one had a hard time socializing with the other monkeys. In fact, it usually just sat there alone. And even when the little monkey tried to approach the other monkeys in the troop to try and become part of the group, he was bullied out. He or she was bullied out. They basically, for some reason, had this knowledge that this little monkey was not raised normal, quote unquote, or with something warm and comfortable. And so the little monkeys, in some cases, would almost be beaten near to death by the rest of them. So that suggested to Harlow that there's something more going on when you have the ability to be comforted and warmed by mother, that it's just not about feeding, it's not just about eating or getting nutrition, that there's a unique bond that is occurring between infant and mother. Okay. Based on this and his different experiments he did with little monkeys, is he came up with what's called his development of attachment. Okay. And he feels like these things kind of happen in a clear-cut way. And indeed, we have found that this attachment process occurs in adults. The ages you see is for young infants, as we see. So what he believed is there's a pre-attachment stage between birth and 6 weeks. This is where the infant attaches to that primary caregiver, which is usually mom. And we call this joint attachment, where the mom becomes totally attached to the infant and the infant becomes totally attached to the mother. Okay. We should note some biological stuff that is going on at this time. So when mom goes into labor, she instantly starts producing a chemical known as oxytocin. Oxytocin is kind of known as the bonding chemical between individuals. When both are producing oxytocin, you become biologically bonded with each other. Okay. But what you have to have is you have to have oxytocin and then you have to have a spike in dopamine in order to reinforce that oxytocin bond. Okay. And it's different between mothers and fathers. Moms, when they're going to attach to something, they instantly, naturally start releasing oxytocin, and the bonding process begins. Okay. For dads and for men, it's a little bit different. For men to release oxytocin, they have to achieve some goal in the relationship, and then they'll release oxytocin, and then the dopamine spike reinforces it. Okay. So, for example, dads often will go with this kind of stereotype of dad doing the first drive home from the hospital. Okay. And so it's the only time in life you'll see a man drive the speed limit and slow down at yellow lights and drive it in the correct lane. Probably the only time in our life is when that first trip, we take our child from the hospital to the home. But what we have found is after that first trip, that's when the dad starts to release oxytocin. And that's when him and his infant become attached with each other. Okay. When we get to the section on young adulthood and we start talking about intimate love and stuff like this, it's the same thing if you're going to attach to your intimate partner. You have to have a release of oxytocin, then a release of dopamine, and then you guys are stuck biologically with each other. Okay. But again, women in the dating situation will, if they are going, or if they are highly interested in the male, they'll start releasing oxytocin right away. Men are a little bit different. They have to achieve something in the relationship before they'll start releasing oxytocin. And a lot of sociologists believe that's why we've had these rituals, these traditional rituals with dating, like, you know, you have to make it to first base, second base, third base, quote unquote, or no sex until you're married. Because what that does is it requires the male specifically to achieve some goal in the relationship. And we know biologically, after that is achieved, that's when they'll start releasing oxytocin. Okay. But back to Harlow and back to infants and children. So we know that this needs to occur on the biological level, and we know this is why in a lot of hospital now, they try to get the infant to the mother as soon as possible, as soon as after birth. They'll do the neurological exams and everything and try and get the infant to the mom as soon as possible. This is why they encourage skin to skin contact, because that even boosts the release of oxytocin for both the infant and the mother. And I should say oxytocin is also the chemical that starts the production of breast milk in moms. So that's another reason why they want to get the infant to mom as soon as possible. And in a lot of cases, this is also why, if they fear that there's a risk of needing to do a C-section or a surgical extrication of the infant, they'll actually put oxytocin in the IV, because unless the infant is born naturally, the production of oxytocin doesn't start right away. So when they do a C-section or something like that, they'll automatically put the oxytocin in the IV that they're providing with the mother. Okay. On the psychological and social level, we know that the more time and whatnot we spend together, the more connection we have, and we start humanizing the infant as soon as possible, begins again that attachment process. In the 6 weeks to about 6 to 8 month, we see attachment in the making. This is when the infant starts to attach to other individuals besides the mother and father. This is when the best time to introduce grandparents and the like. I should note, it is something to be said. I know everybody in the room, when they go and visit mom at the and baby at the hospital. Everyone wants to hold the newborn infant. I will tell you that we've actually found that's incredibly uncomfortable for the newborn infant, because they really have anxiety, as you would say, about making attachments and making connections with other individuals up to about the 6-week mark. And then they can start really integrating. Now, I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm just saying make sure you're very kind. And when the infant starts to squirm, don't think it's about you that the infant is doing that. Around 6 to 8 months to about 24 months, we see clear-cut attachment. This is when we start seeing things like separation anxiety, where the infant will cry or throw a fit if mom or dad leaves for any significant period of time. And then the last one type of attachment to start to develop is around 18 months of age. This is what we call goal-corrected partnerships. This is where the infant or little child that's developing starts to make purposeful attachments to other individuals. They start to choose who they want to be attached to and who they don't want to be attached to. And that's the idea behind goal-corrected partnerships. Before this time, infants, if you want to think of it this way, really don't make a choice of attachment. They will attach to pretty much anyone. Yes, they'll have that separation anxiety from mom and dad, but pretty much attachment can occur with anyone. It's around the 18-month mark where infants start to make a more purposeful attachment with some people and not attached to others. Okay. All right. So that's what we got from Harlow. He really started off this revolution that infants need more than just nourishment and biological sustaining to exist. I think this is something that especially modern mothers have known for a long time, but this was the beginning of the scientific exploration of this thing we call attachment, or emotional bonds with other people. The two psychologists who probably expanded this is Bowlby is going to come up with, and we'll talk about these here in just a minute, about these different types of attachment styles. Okay, we'll come back to this. This is Bowlby's attachment styles, is what he basically said is we have 4 attachment styles: secure, anxious avoidant, anxious ambivalent, and disorganized or disoriented. Okay. And he did this kind of based on Harlow's work and on naturalistic observation of children in child cares or with moms. But it was actually Mary Ainsworth who came along and did actual scientific, quote unquote, experiments on different types of attachments. And the experimental paradigm is what's called the strange situation experiment. Okay. And what the strange situation is you put the infant under different types of stressors. Okay. In this case, basically, mom takes the little child into a playroom and leaves. Okay. And then comes back. And what we do is we look for the infant's response upon the return of the mother. Now, there's 2 conditions this is usually done in. Either the infant or child is left in the room alone, or they're left in the room with a complete stranger. Okay. And we want to see how the infant, one, will respond to the stranger being in the room, if that's a condition. But 2, how does the infant respond when mom returns? Is the infant easily calmed? Is the infant relieved? Does the infant feel? Because remember the idea that parents are a secure base. So when that secure base returns, what is the infant's response? How do they utilize the parent to calm themselves after being in a stressed situation. In Ainsworth, she wanted to know again how infants use mothers as a secure base. And the other thing is how infants use mothers to calm down after being stressed by her departure. Okay, those are the kind of two main goals. And what she found under Bowlby's attachment style is based on the attachment style determines the response of the infant. Okay, and so this is where we're at. Okay. So between Bowlby and Ainsworth, that they're becoming increasingly evidence that we have four kind of basic attachment styles. Okay, and we'll start with this secure one. So when we look at, so this is a type of attachment, and then we have three kind of conditions: security and organization. Security meaning that they feel secure. Organized meaning that their patterns of behaviors are consistent. Okay. Safe base for exploration. This is how the infant uses the caregiver when the caregiver is present to explore the toys in the room or to explore the room. Reunion with caregiver. This is after the caregivers respond and come back to the room. How do they use that caregiver? And then we have this associated with surveys and interviews we did with mothers about how they mother, how they respond to the infants. And what we found is that this early mothering experiences predicted these other four outcomes, okay, or these other four attachment styles. So we find this, and I'll read this kind of backwards. Early mothering for a secure, we found that these mothers tended to be very responsive to the infant's needs, okay? And in the strange situation, we found that infants, when the parent was around, explore freely with the caregiver's presence, okay? I mentioned, I think, when I was talking about one of Erickson's developmental phases, I said the little child will go explore for 15 minutes and then come back and check in on mom. This is what we call this secure base, that an infant is able to use that caregiver to feel secure, but then have the freedom or the ability to freely explore their world. When the mother leaves and come back, we find that the infant seeks out the caregiver and easily soothed by the caregiver. They're easily calmed once the mother has returned. Okay. In our anxious avoidant situation, we find that early mothering is emotionally unavailable and dislikes the neediness of the infant. So if they're constantly, it's kind of that example again, going to trust, mistrust. This is the mom who comes back and goes, "Oh, what do you need now? You're bothering me. You're being too quote unquote needy." Okay. We find that these infants will explore with or without the caregiver's presence. They really, for lack of better words, really don't give a hoot whether the caregiver is there or not to go explore, which resulted in a lot more high risk behaviors on the side of the infant. They were more willing to do high risk behaviors because they already had an emotionally unavailable mom. So why not stick your hand in the light socket kind of idea, okay? And we found that when the caregiver in this situation returns, the infant does not seek out the caregiver for comfort, okay? Now, why is this kind of an interesting thing, this anxious avoidant, right? So they're anxious about being there, but they're avoidant to seek out any comfort, okay? What this results in is when the child goes to a child care or goes to grandma, grandpa's house or something like that, it puts the child at high risk of being that risk taker in the classroom and not necessarily in a positive way, okay? The third one is what we call anxious ambivalent resistant. Okay. So again, the early mothering experience is really someone who is very inconsistent about care. So they may be attentive, but not in response to baby's cues or needs. Okay. This is kind of the mothering style where the mother is attentive when the mother wants to be attentive, but is emotionally unavailable or available physically when the infant actually needs to be comforted in some way or have needs met. Okay. So how do you explain that? It's kind of like the infant is the token infant, only needed when it meets the mother's needs. Okay. So we find that in this situation, this is where an infant will stay very close to the caregiver and doesn't explore freely. So this is that infant who constantly has their arms and legs wrapped around mom's legs. Okay, constantly wants to reach out and be held. Okay, and when the mother returns, both seeks and rejects contact with the caregiver. So this is, you imagine the infant who is crying when you drop the child off at the child care. No, don't leave me here. But then when the parent goes back and picks up the child, they can either be, okay, yeah, let's go, or they'll be like, I'm not ready to go. No, I don't want to go. Okay. And this is kind of what we find with anxious, ambivalent, resistant types of attachment. Okay. And again, it's kind of that inconsistency in behavior and how they use others to feel the ability to explore. Okay. And probably the most devastating kind of attachment style, if you want to use those terms, is the disorganized or disoriented attachment style. In this case, this is what early mothering experience that they show intrusiveness, maltreatment, emotionally unavailable, and confuses the infants by the inconsistent response of the mother. Okay. This is really children who probably are being raised by a mother and father who probably have some type of psychological disorder, some type of psychological issues going on. And so they show an inconsistency in the way that they treat the infant. Okay, it's almost like they don't know how to in a lot of ways. So it leads to maltreatment and or emotional disconnect. Okay. When we find the infant with the mother there, they may freeze. And they often explore in very disorganized fashion, like they almost don't know what to do in that setting. They don't know how they're supposed to be reacting. So either they freeze and they won't necessarily, like in the previous one, they're not necessarily close to the caregiver or over attached to the caregiver, but they're almost frozen in time because they just don't understand what they're supposed to be doing in the situation. When the caregiver comes back, they may go to the caregiver while looking away, kind of like, okay, I have to, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, I guess, and often shows a very dazed and confused look as they do it. Okay. So these are the 4 attachment styles. And as you can imagine, the most favorable to least favorable is kind of on a continuum here. I will tell you that a lot of the times these are scored to where, some areas we're secure in, others we might be anxious avoidant. And so sometimes these can be very contextual based. But what we have found is, as a child starts to develop, dependent upon their attachment style, really shows how easy it is for them to, for example, make friends in early childhood. It determines, how they're going to relate to their siblings and other relatives. And we find that, again, when we look at this from a relation perspective, it's infants who have more of the secure attachment with mom, who tend to be more successful at making and maintaining friendships, having better relationships with their siblings. And as we go down these different attachment styles, the harder and harder it is for the child to make friendships, maintain friendships, and to have relationships with other siblings and other adults. So that's why we should someday just add another column here that explains, that to more clearly. Okay. So the question becomes too, is what factors are related to making it, helping an infant and mother and to become a more secure and develop more secure children. Okay. We have to realize that it's not just about holding an infant. It's not just about responding to its needs. There's many factors that we need to look at. One is attachment is a product of numerous factors. I just said that. Mothers being sensitive and responsive can be predictive of secure or insecure attachment. Now, let me explain this. So how could it that a sensitive mother, a very responsive mother, both produce a secure attachment, but could also, with a flip of a coin, produce an insecure attachment? Okay. And it really comes down to how we can be sensitive and responsive to people's needs. But the time we invest in that relationship building really determines whether that sensitivity and responsiveness will result in secure or insecure attachment. Okay. We have also found there's a large amount of literature. Originally, most of the attachment theories have focused on the mother-child relationship. But we're finding more and more that fathers being sensitive is also important. A father who is available, a father who is there, also plays a role in the attachment style that the infant is going to develop. Okay. And a lot have argued that if we look at attachment styles through the decades here in the United States, we're starting to produce more and more children with insecure attachment styles. And that's directly associated with the increase of fatherless homes. Okay. And so we're seeing that dad does play an important role in the attachment of the infant. Then there's some biological factors that need to be taken into consideration. For example, we talked about temperament, which really determines how sensitive a parent is going to respond to an infant. And so learning an infant's temperament really is predictive of whether an infant will have an insecure attachment. The quicker the temperament, the more likely the parent is going to respond in more of a negative manner. And so that's more predictive of a child who will end up with an insecure attachment. And then there's also something called infantile colic. Okay, if you've ever had a colic baby, they're infants who have all of their needs met. They even could have a very sensitive and caring parents, but the infant constantly is crying almost for no reason whatsoever. Okay. And this is what's called a colic baby. All right. We know in a very understandable way, colicky infants can be very, very frustrating to parents, and their ability to attach and be secure with that infant. Okay. So again, the infantile colicky babies tend to produce more of an insecure attachment because the parents are constantly questioning themselves of what they're doing wrong, Why doesn't their infant, quote unquote, love or care for them, and isn't comforted when, and so they start to react to the infant in a less and less sensitive manner. Okay. So these are all kind of factors that play into attachment, that it's not just about mom and infant holding each other, skin to skin contact. There's a whole other different types of factors that go into play in creating infants with secure attachments versus non-secure attachments. Okay. We also should talk about biology and culture. I already mentioned the issues of oxytocin. Has a very important role on a biological level. And we do find that, infants who have been neglected in infancy and the like, as they get older, they actually produce less oxytocin than infants who were not neglected. So as we start going through early childhood and stuff, and we start seeing some of the biological effects of neglect and abuse, this is kind of one of the beginning processes of our biology responding to our social world. We have found that infants who have been in neglectful homes and abusive homes as adults tend to produce less oxytocin as they age compared to those who were not neglected. Okay. We also know our culture tends to predict different types of attachments. So the predominant attachment in America and North America is avoidant attachment, is mostly categorized in that insecure attachment style. So when we say most or many, what we're talking is a 50% or more. Okay. Once we get under 50%, we kind of say, well, there's different attachments, but this is 50% of our population or more has an avoidant insecure attachment style. Whereas when we look at places like Israel, Korea, and Japan, they tend to have an anxious ambivalent is the most common type of attachment style. And we believe that the reason why these two negative attachment styles occur, the difference between Israel, Korea, and Japan here in North Europe and Americas, is the different types of predominant cultural aspects. When we look at America and North Europe, we tend to be what's called individualistic cultures, or individualism, which focuses on autonomy of the individual, that the individual is responsible for all their successes and all their failures. It's on the individual. And so this creates an avoidant type of an attachment because other people in your world in an individualistic society are not that important to your success or failure. You are, okay? Versus when we looked at places like Japan, Korea, and Israel that focus on what's called collectivism or social harmony, as you would say, in these cultures, my success, my failures are not my own. They are my parents. They are my communities. If I fail, my community fails. If I fail, my family fails. If I'm successful, my family's. And so there's much less focus on the individual. And if you think about what this creates a lot of anxiety about, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing for my community? And so it can create that kind of anxious, ambivalent attachment style because you really are very anxious about making sure you're doing the right thing for your community. You're doing the right thing for your family. Okay. So this is how culture plays a role in different attachment styles. Now, When we look at attachment styles, we've always thought in early theories, we believe that infant attachment predicted adult attachment. Okay. And we have found that infant attachment is predictive of adults' ability to maintain secure relationships later in life. Okay. However, there's some caveats we have to put into this. Okay. It's only if life stays consistent for the infant go into adulthood. Okay. Because if some life event comes in, maybe the parents passing away, or maybe a natural disaster and they have to leave, or they are constantly moving from place to place, this can change a person's attachment style. It can change someone into more of an insecure attachment style when major changes in the family system occur. Okay. But we have found, though, and this is kind of the good part, is we can use interventions that can change insecure attachment styles to secure attachment styles. So what I'm saying is you know, if you're concerned about your child because you lost your job and you have to move, or another parent passes away or leaves the home, and you're afraid that that's going to ruin the child and their ability to have relationships, there's actually, we found interventions that can come in and help the child regain a sense of security. Okay. I think that's the good news on that part, because, you know, what life doesn't have change in it. Okay. We find that child's later peer relationships can also be predictive of later romantic relationships. Okay. And this is the trajectory that we see with attachment. Infant attachment is very predictive of the childhood friends that a child is going to make. Okay. So it's very predictive of if they're going to have healthy friendships or not healthy, if they're going to have many friends or few friends. And then those friends follow that child into adolescence. Okay. And it's actually the biggest predictor of who someone is going to, say, quote unquote, marry, who they're going to date, is more predictive of peer relationships in adolescence than it is mom and dad. Okay. But this is how that attachment goes into that, is that attachment in infancy predicts the friendships a child is going to make, which predicts the peers they're going to have in adolescence. And it's going to be those peers who will predict who they date and who they're going to be romantically related with in a relationship. Does that make sense? That kind of trail of progress. Okay. Now we talked about behavior, we've talked about behavioral responses to the strange situation based on attachment styles. We should spend some time, and this is why, again, we want to promote more secure attachment styles, because we should look at the internal working models that infants learn as they're being attached to their caregiver. Okay. And when we talk about internal working models, we talk about the cognitive and emotional model the child is building about themselves and their relation with the world. Okay. And so when we've tried to dig into the internal workings of infants, usually when they've started to develop language and stuff like this is what we kind of have found categorically with each of these different attachment styles that we observe in young childhood. Okay. So the internal working model of a child who is secure is a belief that they can trust and rely on others. But I think this is the more important one. I am lovable, capable, significant, and worthwhile. It's a belief that they are actually lovable and capable of doing things in the world. And they recognize, the world is pretty safe for the most part, okay, and can be trusted. When we look at the anxious avoidant child, we see that the others are unavailable and rejecting is the perception they have, and that I have to protect myself. Mom and dad are not going to do it, so I'm going to have to do that on my own. Okay. If I deny my needs, I will not be rejected. If I do what is expected of me, I will not be rejected. If I take care of others and deny my own needs, I will be loved. Okay. So in a sense, what this internal working model is as long as I don't give a crap about me and what I need and what I need to do, then I will not be rejected and I'll finally be loved. Okay. If you think about this, this is definitely if in adulthood, when a person becomes kind of the caretaker of everybody at the demise of their own well-being, this is that anxious avoidant type of attachment. Okay, this is where that mindset comes from. All right. When we look at the anxious, ambivalent, and resistant, this is others are unpredictable, sometimes loving and protective, sometimes hostile and rejecting. So what does the infant think about themselves? I don't know what to expect, hence I'm anxious and usually angry. I cannot explore. I might miss the opportunity for love and affection because you never know when it's going to occur. If I can read others and get them to respond, I will get my needs met, meaning that, again, I have to look out for number one, and therefore I have to be very off with other people because I have to constantly be reading them and trying to think, what is their motives? What are they trying to get out of me? Okay. And then our last one is the disorganized, disoriented. This is my caregiver at times seems overwhelmed by me, and at other times seems very angry with me. Remember when we did that trust versus mistrust, and I showed that example of mistrust where the mother or whoever is just very aggressive because the infant is there bothering the individual, I think I used soap opera in the example, or the TV show. The internal working models is that others are abusive. They're neglectful, physically, emotionally, and or sexually abusive. That you cannot trust anyone because they're either going to physically, emotionally, or sexually abuse you. Okay. And so this is the I worked with a lot of women in my years, and this mindset, okay, even when you say, well, a person who has been abused by their husband and maybe another boyfriend at a time, those two individuals become to represent everyone in that person's life. And when we look at it, when we go back to it, it goes back to this disorganized, disoriented type of attachment style that the individual has developed. Okay. I am unable to get my needs met. I don't know how to protect myself. Okay. So if we think about this, this is almost that individual who's on the end of probably definitely developing some type of psychosis or mental type of disorder. This is the individual who probably is going to be the person who gets bullied in later life because they'll be an easy target. This is the individual that definitely people who need power and control are going to dominate over and are going to create as the victims of their needs when we talk about that. So, and again, I'm talking about this in the context that this is why we believe that that early stages of attachment are really important, because it sets up these internal working models that are going to be carried with the infant through life. But again, I'll go back really quick. Interventions can help change those attachment styles. Okay. Meaning that if you are at this level, you have this internal working model that everybody is abusive and neglectful. Those kind of perceptions and those kind of internal working models can be changed with the right types of intervention. Okay. And I'll end with this. We do know that there are two types of attachment disorders. Okay. And I'll just go through these really quick as they're written. A disinhibited social engagement disorder. This is an attachment disorder in which the children approach strangers indiscriminately, not differentiating between attachment figures and other people. In this situation, this is when a child totally has no social boundaries with anyone. They will go to anyone, they will walk with anyone, they will, even if that person is highly dangerous. You could put a child like this in a room of murderers and they will try and get along with all of them indiscriminately. Okay. Reactive attachment disorder, or RAD. This is a more common version of attachment disorder, is a disorder marked by the inability to form attachments with caregivers. They just have that, they just can't seem to be able to get care and needs taken care of because of their reaction. Either they act way aggressive and out of control, or they just are very despondent to the caregiver's demands or caregiver's questions. Okay. Now, I should note that these disorders are very interesting in their development. Okay. If these disorders are not treated by the age of 8, okay, attachment treatment is ineffective. Okay. Treating attachment disorders, the effectiveness of treatment is really, really high. Most of the treatment, 90% is done with the caregiver, and then 10% is done with the child. And it's very, very effective, but it has to be done before the age of 8. I have a good friend who did attachment disorder treatment, and he said even if they were in the middle of a treatment protocol, if the child turned 8, they stopped the treatment because it was no longer effective after that. What we have found is untreated attachment disorders result in conduct disorder after the age of 8. Conduct disorder is when a child starts entering into juvenile type crimes and criminal type behaviors. That conduct disorder then leads to what we call antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. So there's a clear developmental trajectory: attachment disorder, conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. And if we don't catch this by the age of 8, this is a difficult part about this. After about the age of 8, it's no longer something that is treatable. You can't treat conduct disorder. You can't treat antisocial personality disorder. It's a life management thing from there on out. Okay. It's having to have social workers in the person's life, having to have therapists and the legal system involved in that person's life in order for them to try and stay as stable as they can as they make it through life. So attachment disorders, which is an extreme reaction to relationships, this is one area where attachment does predict very clearly developmental trajectories. And again, attachment disorder, conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder is the developmental trajectory if we don't intervene before about the age of 8. Okay. Now, there's a lot of theories of what it is about the age of 8 that something psychologically changes within the individual. We believe it has a lot to do with it's around the age of 8 where most individuals will experience their first true loss in life, such as the death of a grandparent or the loss of a pet or something like that. And it seems that there is a good relationship between loss and attachment disorder not being treatable. Okay. And we think the reason that age 8 there is when you get that cognitive model that life will end someday. And this is the way things are. Okay. So that's a current theory that has been proposed at why, for some reason, the age of 8, these disorders are not treatable. But it is just a theory at this point. We really don't have a good answer to why attachment disorders become untreatable after this point. Okay. All right. That is attachment. That is infancy. I open the floor. Let me stop recording so everyone can feel like they can ask